Athelstan, 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 Athelstan. There is even doubt about the exact pronunciation of his name, but who was he, and why would Freemasons commemorate and venerate an obscure 10th century king who reigned for about 14 years and who died well over 1080 years ago? Before we look at the life and times of King Athelstan closer, it would be as well to remind ourselves of how the island called Britain was organised and governed at the end of the 9th century. Following the departure of the Romans early in the 5th century, southern and western Britain had been invaded by a series of Germanic people, comprising of the Saxons, the Angles, the Frisi and the Jutes, who set up Anglo-Saxon kingdoms principally in the southern half of Britain. In northern and eastern Britain, large tracts of land were ruled by Scandinavian Viking invaders, who controlled the kingdoms of York and who established the Danelaw. By the start of the 10th century, the Anglo-Saxon map of what was to become known as England comprised of 7 principal kingdoms: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex and Wessex. Facing the threat of invasion by the Vikings from the north and the east, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Wessex and Mercia unified under Alfred, King of Wessex, and so the House of Wessex provided the dominant ruler of what was now called the Kingdom of the Angles-Saxon, or the English peoples. Alfred the Great ruled as King of Wessex from 871 until his death in 899. He is the only English ruler ever to be accorded the title Great, and he successfully staved off all attempts by the Vikings to invade the Anglo-Saxon Angles-Saxon. Alfred was succeeded by his son, Edward the Elder, born in 874, who was crowned king some 25 years later in 899 at Winchester, the then capital of Wessex, where he subsequently held court. Edward was an accomplished soldier and finally conquered the Danes in 917, extending his rule to the East Midlands and to East Anglia. Thus, his empire grew and Edward became not only King of Wessex and Mercia, he was now considered the overall ruler of Anglo-Saxon England. Edward supposedly married 3 times and in all had 14 children, the eldest being Athelstan, born around 893, by his first wife, or some say his concubine, Egwin. Edward had 2 crowned queens and at least 3 legal concubines. When Egwin either died or was put aside by Edward, he married Ethelflaed, and she bore him a son, Ethelweard, who would later become a contender for the throne when his father died. It is quite possible that Edward favoured his younger son above Athelstan, but Athelstan's grandfather, Alfred, certainly thought highly of Athelstan and had earlier presented him with a scarlet cloak and a bejewelled belt and sword with a gilt scabbard. It is thought by some historians that this display of favour was a clear indication that, in Alfred's eyes at any rate, Athelstan was destined for greatness. Athelstan was raised by his aunt, Ethelflaed, the Lady of Mercia, at the Mercian court, and most certainly fought in her continual military campaigns to conquer the Danelaw. In any event, Athelstan would become a great warrior and was known in his own lifetime as a fiercely courageous soldier and a supreme military tactician. When Edward died on the 17th of July 924, it appears that a struggle for succession arose between the 2 sons, Athelstan and Ethelweard, because whereas Athelstan was declared king by the people of Mercia, Ethelweard was declared king by the people of Wessex. It is thought by some historians that it had been Edward's intention, following his death, that his kingdom be divided between his 2 sons in this way. But fate was to intervene very quickly, as Ethelweard died on the 2nd of August 924, only 16 days after his father, and in fact was buried with him. There is no record of how Ethelweard died, so we shall never know whether he died of natural causes or was simply murdered by Athelstan's supporters. At any rate, this left the way clear for Athelstan to assume total control, and he was eventually crowned king of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom on the 4th of September 925, over a full year later, and not at Winchester, but at Kingston-upon-Thames, a strategic border between the three major parts of his kingdom, the setting being the small wooden chapel of St. Mary's Church, which is now encapsulated by the famous medieval building of All Saints' Church. Incidentally, his coronation ceremony was the first time the coronation service laid out the responsibilities the king and his people had to each other, and it was the first time the Christian hymn Te Deum was sung, as it still is today. The coronation order compiled for Athelstan was used for subsequent coronations right through to the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953. Two other interesting aspects regarding Athelstan's coronation are that Athelstan was the first king to be anointed and ordained with the crown placed upon his head, rather than a helmet, which was the tradition of the day. Secondly, Athelstan was crowned seated upon a special stone, known as the Coronation Stone, on which 6 other Anglo-Saxon kings were crowned, and it is interesting to note that all English monarchs since Edward I have been crowned seated on a symbolic stone. The Coronation Stone at Kingston was probably recovered from the ruins of St. Mary's Church, and was such a national importance that when it was moved in 1850, it was moved with full Masonic ceremonial, and it was such an important event that Queen Victoria called a national holiday throughout the British Empire. Although a millennium has passed since the coronations of the Saxon kings at Kingston-upon-Thames, the Coronation Stone remains on display in the town outside the Guild Hall, and is about to be returned to its original place at All Saints' Church, again with full Masonic ceremonial, this time by the Masonic Order of Athelstan. Back to Athelstan. It is clear that he had every intention of driving out all the eastern and northern invaders, and to bring the Scots and the Welsh into submission. Early in his reign, Sitric, King of York, proposed an alliance with Athelstan, and at Tamworth in 926, Athelstan gave Sitric one of his sisters in marriage. Sitric died soon afterwards, and York was taken over by his son, Olaf, from a former marriage, and he was accepted as king by the Northumbrian Vikings. Athelstan, by the marriage of his sister, claimed York, and his response was to attack the Viking stronghold in 927 and to destroy its fortifications and capture the city. The king then travelled northwards, taking the opportunity to subjugate the Northumbrian Vikings and the North Northumbrians, whilst also invading the Scottish kingdoms in a joint army and naval assault. Finally, in 927, at Ademont Bridge in Dacre, in Cumbria, he forced the submission of King Constantine of Scotland and all the other northern kings, plus the already subdued 5 Welsh kings, including the Great Hywel Dda. Athelstan from then on received huge annual tributes from those now sub-kings, including, it is recorded, £20 of gold, £300 of silver, and 25,000 oxen. Interestingly, during the 927 campaigns, Athelstan followed his grandfather's reverence of the Northumbrian Saint Cuthbert. As he travelled north from York to sort out those troublesome Northumbrians, he paid homage to Saint Cuthbert, whose body was at the time housed at the Abbey at Chesterley Street. There he lavished many gifts, including a copy of St. Bede's Psalter, which included a portrait of Athelstan handing the book to St. Cuthbert, and this is the first ever recorded, verified image of an English king. Some of the gifts given by Athelstan at that time can still be viewed in the Crypt Museum at Durham Cathedral. Following this unchallenged invasion of Scotland in 927, Athelstan in 934 launched another attack on the Scots, probably because Constantine had violated the original peace treaty. It became apparent that Athelstan could only be defeated by an alliance of all of his enemies, and in 937 this came to pass at one of the famous turning points in history, the Battle of Brunanburh, known for centuries thereafter as the Great Slaughter. On one side, the combined armies and navies of Wessex and Mercia, led from the front by Athelstan and his half-brother Edmund, pitted against the alliance of the armies of Olaf Guthrisson, King of Dublin, Constantine II, King of Scotland, and Owain, King of Strathclyde. What followed was the bloodiest battle ever fought on British soil, and it lasted a full day, and eventually the invaders were ruthlessly routed by King Athelstan. The Annals of Ulster describe the battle as great, lamentable and horrible, and record that several thousand of Norsemen fell. Among the casualties were 5 kings and 7 earls from Olaf's army. The poem records that Constantine lost several friends and family, including his only son. The Anglo-Saxon chronicle recounts that were never yet as many people killed before this with the sword's edge, since the East Angles and the Saxons came up over the broad sea. The actual site of the battle remained lost, that is until November 2019, some 1,082 years after the battle, when it was announced that the site had been located on the Wirral and its location is being kept secret for the moment. The battle is cited as the point of origin for English nationalism. Historians such as Michael Livingston argue that the men who fought and died on that field forged the political map of the future that remains into modernity, arguably making the Battle of Brunanburh one of the most significant battles in the long history not just of England, but the whole of the British Isles. In victory, Athelstan had secured the whole of England, Scotland and Ireland, afterwards assuming the title King of all the English, then further styling himself as Rex Totius Britannicus, King of all Britain. Athelstan had attributes other than warlike ones, and right from the start of his reign in 925, he set about reforming English law, particularly in areas of monetary exchange and business ethics. He introduced legislation which set the weight of silver coins, with the first unified coin and full control of all royal mints. He introduced laws to combat theft and corruption in business dealings. He was also kind to the poor and introduced taxation of those who were wealthy landowners and who owned large properties in order to provide funds for the poor. His land reforms remained in place until 1965 and 1974, when some of the burghs and counties he founded were redesignated. So, Athelstan is not just an obscure 10th century king, but one forgotten by history, and without doubt he was one of the greatest kings ever to have lived in these isles. Indeed, like his grandfather Alfred, Athelstan did indeed earn an illustrious title as Athelstan the Glorious, although this fell out of use as his daring deeds faded over the centuries. A fantastic epic tale and a history lesson from over 1,000 years ago. But what on earth, you may ask, has this Anglo-Saxon king got to do with Freemasonry? The answer is everything.